Okay, so my talk is about an aspect of British military medical services in the First World War, which is perhaps less well known and less well researched. I hope to demonstrate that 1915 was a turning point in the acceptance of women doctors in military medical service. I'm going to briefly outline the status of and attitudes to women doctors at the outbreak of the First World War, and how this started to change in 1914 with their service in voluntary medical units for the Allies. This in turn influenced some key figures and led to women doctors being asked to set up hospitals for British troops. Their acceptance by the RAMC, the Royal Army Medical Corps, the troops and the public influenced the subsequent attachment of women doctors to the RAMC in 1916. Firstly, some background. In 1914, there were about 1,000 women doctors on the medical register in Britain. However, they generally held posts that were regarded as less attractive and of lower status by male doctors, although of no less importance medically. They worked in public health, schools and mental asylums, treated women and children, often in hospitals and dispensaries set up by women doctors, or as missionary doctors abroad. Although some became experienced in surgery on women, surgery on men was virtually closed to them. Not, perhaps, the best training for treating war casualties. At the outbreak of war, many women doctors offered their services to the War Office and the BRCS, the British Red Cross Society, but were rejected. Women doctors in the Dominions were treated similarly. In Edinburgh, Dr. Elsie Inglis was famously told to go home and sit still, while Dr. Agnes Bennett in New Zealand to go home and knit. Needless to say, they did neither. Instead, women doctors set up voluntary medical units, many staffed completely by women, and treated Allied casualties in Belgium, France, Serbia, and Russia, where they were welcomed. By the summer of 1915, 50 British women doctors were working in Serbia alone, treating casualties and coping with the typhus epidemic there. Many women doctors supported the suffrage movement, which is not surprising given their professional struggles. Their voluntary units were partially or wholly funded by suffrage supporters. For example, the Scottish Women's Hospitals, which was one of the largest organisations and set up by Dr. Elsie Inglis, was funded by the National Union of Suffrage Societies, the NUWSS. I will be focusing on the Women's Hospital Corps, or WHC, a voluntary unit which was set up in August 1914 by suffragette doctors. Before I do, I would just like to talk about another woman doctor, Dr. Florence Stoney. In 1914, she'd been a radiologist for 13 years and had just acquired the most up-to-date X-ray equipment from America. The offer of her services and equipment to the War Office was also refused. Undaunted, in August 1914, she went to Antwerp as head of a voluntary unit for the Belgian Red Cross. It was organised by Mrs. St. Clair Stobart, who in 1912, during the First Balkan War, had taken the Women's Convoy Corps to the Balkans. She ran a hospital there, staffed by women doctors, looking after wounded for the Bulgarian Red Cross. The hospital in Antwerp was for Belgian and French casualties. The photo shows the staff outside the hospital building. Due to inadequate and improvised British military medical services, some Royal Marines were treated there when they were involved in the siege of Antwerp. As Antwerp fell, the hospital staff escaped in some London buses, which were some of the last vehicles to leave before the bridge over the River Scheldt was destroyed. Florence Stoney was subsequently awarded the 1914 Star with Clasp, which was sanctioned by the Admiralty. She'd continued working in the hospital while it was heavily shelled by the Germans for over 18 hours. The unit then went to Cherbourg to work for the French Red Cross. When Florence Stoney returned to England, she was appointed radiologist at Fulham Military Hospital, London, in March 1915, where she specialised in using X-rays to locate bullets and shrapnel in wounds. Returning to the Women's Hospital Corps. This was set up by these two women doctors, Louisa Garrett Anderson on the left and Flora Murray on the right. They were both ardent suffragettes and members of the WSPU, the Women's Social and Political Union. Louisa was the daughter of Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, the first British women doctor on the medical register. She was a surgeon, and although she only operated on women and children, she'd had some postgraduate training in America with a professor of surgery who worked in the Spanish-American War. In 1912, she'd been imprisoned for breaking a window during a suffrage protest. Flora Murray was a physician and anaesthetist. She'd looked after suffragettes released from prison after hunger strikes, including Mrs. Pankhurst, and those injured during demonstrations. So as they were both marked women, as far as the authorities were concerned, they thought there was no point in approaching the War Office. They set up the WHC within weeks of the outbreak of war, after being accepted by the French Red Cross. They were, however, driven more by their desire to further suffrage and to prove that women were the equal of men, wearing their WSPU badges on their uniforms. By mid-September 1914, they'd opened a hospital in the Hotel Claridge in Paris to treat French casualties. Here you can see the hospital staff outside the Hotel Claridge, wearing the uniforms of the WHC. They found them very useful in gaining respect from the public and allowing them free travel on trains. However, events changed their situation very rapidly. Following the retreat from Mons, British military medical services were in chaos. There were no motor ambulances, only horse-drawn ones, lorries, and trains, often consisting of just cattle trucks to evacuate casualties. Base hospitals moved before they were properly set up. As a result, there was much delay and suffering. Casualty evacuation routes were changed from using the channel ports, such as Boulogne and Le Havre, to the Atlantic ports of Nantes and Saint-Nazaire. The trains evacuating casualties were routed around Paris. They offloaded the most seriously injured at stations there, where they were picked up by motor ambulances belonging to voluntary medical units. On her first day in Paris, Louisa Garrett Anderson was driven by another English doctor to one of the Paris stations and was shocked to see the wounded just left there. On the day the Hotel Claridge opened, a doctor from the American Voluntary Hospital at Newell asked Louisa Garrett Anderson if she could take British casualties. The following day, 50 British wounded were admitted to the Hotel Claridge. Within hours, they were operating on casualties in the hotel's converted ladies' cloakroom. Here you can see Flora Murray with her back to us in anaesthetic. The two women doctors operating either side of her had only just qualified. Louisa Garrett Anderson described how she was pleased to to get unique surgical experience, working incessantly from 8 a.m. to 11 p.m. or later. After years of unpopularity over suffrage, it's very exhilarating to be on top of the wave, helped and approved by everyone, while all the time we are still doing suffrage work. During September and early October, their beds were occupied mostly by British rather than French wounded. These three men were to become key figures, and they were all connected in some way. Lord Esher, eminence grise with royal, political and military connections, had chaired the pre-war Esher Committee that had driven army reforms. Lord Kitchener, the public hero who had been made Secretary of State for War. And Sir Alfred Keogh, an army surgeon who had dealt with the chaotic medical services during the Boer War. He was later made Director General of Medical Services, reforming them until his retirement in 1910. He was already in France on holiday in Brittany when war broke out, and was made Chief Commissioner of the St. John's Ambulance Association and British Red Cross in France. Based in Rouen, he witnessed the chaotic medical services and involved the voluntary services in trying to alleviate the situation. In September 1914, Lord Esher was sent to France by Lord Kitchener to try to smooth over his strained relationship with Sir John French. While he was there, he discovered the appalling conditions of British casualties. Quoting from his journal of the 30th of September, "The one blot upon the campaign so far is the care of the wounded. It takes a train from 3 to 5 days to get within reach of the base hospital. The men who are being sent to England are lucky if they can get there in 13 days. During the whole of this time, the wounded are inadequately tended and their dressings are seldom changed. A certain number of fortunate wounded are picked up by philanthropic marauders, if one may use that term, under the aegis of the French Red Cross, and have found themselves in comfortable hospitals in Paris." One of these marauders was Louisa Garrett Anderson. Lord Esher visited the voluntary hospitals in Paris. On arriving at the Hotel Claridge, he asked why there were no proper surgeons. But after visiting the wards and talking to the wounded, he, together with senior RAMC officers, changed their views. On returning to London, Lord Esher discussed the state of the wounded with Kitchener, who reappointed Keogh Director General of Medical Services. Keogh had liaised with Lord Esher over pre-war army reforms. Medical services improved with the provision of motor ambulances, proper ambulance trains, and the official use of voluntary hospitals for British troops. By the end of October 1914, during the First Battle of Ypres, the Channel ports were in use again. The WHC was asked to open a hospital in Boulogne to help with the huge numbers of casualties evacuated there. They set up another hospital in the Hotel Mauricien in Wimereux, just outside Boulogne. It was officially attached to 14 Stationary Hospital, so they were provided with rations, coal, and petrol. At the same time, 2 WHC doctors were attached to 13 Stationary Hospital at the Gare Maritime in Boulogne for 5 months, although they were still paid by the WHC. The War Diary of 13th Stationary Hospital for 29th of October states that they got 6 Red Cross nurses and 4 lady doctors to assist with dressings. As 1,000 casualties a day were passing through the hospital, this is not perhaps the full story. The diary of Kate Finzi, a Red Cross nurse at 13 Stationary Hospital, describes the situation 2 days later. The lady doctors have been invaluable, their zeal unflagging. They are splendid operators, and in the midst of the worst rushes, never careless. There is a more positive entry in the 13 Stationary Hospital War Diary of 25th of March, 1915. Very short of MOs now, especially as 2 lady doctors, Jobson and Blandy, left yesterday. Meanwhile, when Lord Esher visited the Wimereux Hospital on the 28th of November, Louisa Garrett Anderson described him as quite friendly, considering his desperate hostility a few weeks ago. To demonstrate just how much his views had changed, in January 1915, Lord Esher wrote to her, "I have urged very strongly on Sir Alfred Keogh and the Red Cross Council, but no one has done more splendid work, and that were I wounded, I would prefer your hospital to any I have seen, and I have seen most. It will be a disaster for our poor fellows if your sympathetic handling of them were withdrawn." Lord Esher was not the only person to be impressed. Letters from patients and relatives were received, thanking them for their care. One widow thanked Louisa Garrett Anderson for the careful and devoted attention she'd given her husband. WHC Dr. Hazel Cuthbert described the British wounded at the hospital as always courteous, grateful, and wonderfully philosophical. One incident at Wimereux was later portrayed in a cartoon in Punch. When Louisa Garrett Anderson saw a patient looking embarrassed, she recognised him as the police officer who had arrested her in Whitehall. But he said, "We'll let bygones be bygones." In February 1915, at the instigation of Sir Arthur Sloggett, Director General of Medical Services in France, and Lord Esher, Murray and Garrett Anderson had a meeting with Keogh in London. He'd heard nothing but good about them and asked if they would shut both the hospitals in France and run a military hospital in London. However, Keogh was not without some misgivings. Frederick Marsh, Professor of Surgery at Cambridge, had written an article stating that women made ideal medical students, impressive doctors, and exceptional surgeons. On the 2nd of March 1915, Keogh wrote to Marsh responding to the article. "Very glad to hear you agree with my revolutionary proposal to entrust the working of a large military hospital to medical women. I hope they won't let me down." The WHC Hospital in London became known as Endell Street Military Hospital. It was set up in the disused St Giles and St George's Workhouse in Covent Garden. However, although Keogh was won over, Flora Murray and Louisa Garrett Anderson faced obstructive and difficult RAMC officers who went out of their way not to help them. When they arrived to inspect the alterations, a crusty RAMC officer greeted them saying, "Good God, women!" Eventually, after making a direct appeal to Keogh, they were given carte blanche to make their own arrangements and were sent on a military administration course at Millbank to help them run the hospital on military lines. 17 wards were created with over 500 beds, all named after female saints, with the exception of a room in the basement, which was named the Johnny Walker ward and housed drunk soldiers who turned up at the hospital. Within a week of taking its first casualties on the 12th of May 1915, the hospital was full. Endell Street was one of the largest military hospitals in London. Over the next 5 years, it treated 26,000 casualties, with convoys such as the one in the image, arriving from the main London stations day and night, as well as British troops, Canadian, Anzac and American casualties were treated at Endell Street. It also had a casualty department, which treated a total of 20,000 patients and ran 3 convalescent hospitals in North London. 37 women doctors and 1 dentist worked there between 1914 and 1919. They were mostly British, but 5 Australian and 1 Canadian also worked there. Flora Murray's book about Endell Street, published after the end of the war, is such a glowing portrayal, it was perhaps written more as British suffrage propaganda, as she makes no mention of the Dominion women doctors. Wendy Moore's recently published book on Endell Street presents a more realistic account of the tensions and fluctuating staff morale there. Even though there was a lot at stake in proving their abilities, the doctors were not afraid of innovation. Louisa Garrett Anderson used the concept of listening to the patient and discussing treatment options rather than the doctor knows best approach, which was the norm then. As a result, the men trusted the women doctors and their treatment, even refusing to be moved to other hospitals to be treated by a male doctor when offered the opportunity. Endell Street was involved in some pioneering medical research, including improving wound healing using bismuth iodoform paraffin paste, otherwise known as BIP. This was published in the BMJ and is still in use today. The results were so good that when Keogh visited in 1916, he was so impressed that it was subsequently used in other military hospitals. Relieved that his gamble had paid off, he told them, "I knew you could do it. You've silenced all critics." Compared to other British military hospitals, the Endell Street women doctors were exceptional, being paid the same rates as male doctors in the RAMC. Louisa Garrett Anderson again. The officers at Endell Street were graded, but not commissioned. Dr. Murray ranked as Lieutenant Colonel, I as Major, others as captains or lieutenants for purposes of pay and allowances. Flora Murray, seen in the image, was the commanding officer as well as an anaesthetist and had minimal problems with patient discipline. This had been used as a reason for refusing to allow women doctors in military medical service. In fact, they had fewer disciplinary problems at Endell Street than at other military hospitals. The staff respected Flora Murray and Louisa Garrett Anderson, who they referred to as the COs, and some admitted to being terrified of them. The rest of the hospital staff were all called by their surnames, although often shortened to a nickname. Flora Murray and Louisa Garrett Anderson were keen for Endell Street to demonstrate women's equal capabilities, and the hospital's motto was "Deeds, not words," exactly the same as the WSPU's. Apart from a few RAMC orderlies, Endell Street was staffed entirely by women, including several active suffragettes. Many of the women orderlies were society girls, so much so that some patients referred to the WHC as the "What Ho Corps." They adapted to the hard domestic and ward work so well that they were used to demonstrate to skeptical RAMC officers when the War Office was urging the use of women in place of men in other hospitals. The patients at Endell Street were provided with plenty of distractions. There were frequent entertainments, parties, outings, and many visitors, including members of the royal family. Publicity was encouraged, with newspaper and magazine articles published in Britain and all over the world. As well as promoting women doctors' achievements, it was hoped it would influence public opinion on women's suffrage. Letters from grateful patients were published, such as Australian Private Crouch in the Sydney Daily Telegraph. The management is good and the surgeons take great interest in and pains with their patients. They will persevere for months with a shattered limb before amputation to try and save it. The whole hospital is a triumph for women. Some wounded had heard about Endell Street in France and asked to go to the best hospital in London. To conclude, I hope I have demonstrated that 1915 was a turning point in women doctors' acceptance. The hospitals run by the WHC happened to be in the right place at the right time to take advantage of the chaotic medical services in 1914 and demonstrate their capabilities. They convinced several key figures, not least Sir Alfred Keogh as Director General of Medical Services, who in a letter to Louisa Garrett Anderson in January 1918 said, "I think your success has probably done more for the cause of women than anything else I know of." The following quote appeared in the Times on the 22nd of January 1915 and illustrates the change in public opinion. During the last 12 months, however, a change of attitude has been clearly discernible, a change which the war has now abruptly completed. The woman doctor is no longer looked at with suspicion if she controls a hospital or directs a dispensary. From 1916 onwards, over 260 women doctors were attached to the RAMC in Britain, Malta, Salonika, Egypt, Palestine, and Constantinople. Finally, here is an image of doctors in Malta. The three women wearing hats are doctors attached to the RAMC. They were not given a uniform, or commissions, or equal pay, or conditions. But that is another story. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks for that, George, Antonia, and Bill. Those were three excellent presentations. In the usual way, perhaps we can raise our hands as a silent but nevertheless heartfelt appreciation of the work that's been done by our three speakers in entertaining us this afternoon. And I know you can't see these, but there is a cacophony of hands going up, if to mix the metaphor, so you can virtually hear, hopefully, the round of applause. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's the Q&A time. John Bromwich asks, how many women were able to get how were women able to get medical training qualifications in these times?
Okay, well, before the First World War, no London medical schools were open to women, apart from the London School of Medicine for Women, which was set up by a woman doctor, totally run by women doctors, and to train women doctors. So also they could train in Scotland, Ireland, and in the provinces. But during the war itself, eventually the London medical schools did open up to women, reluctantly, but they did. But the doors slammed shut again in the 20s.
Okay, thanks for that. Right, next pair of questions, I'll do them as another linked one as well for Antonia. One from Linda Wedderburn, who asks, did the success of women doctors have an effect on the acceptance of women doctors after the war? And a similar one from Pat Adamson, did most of these women doctors stay in the profession after the Great War? Now they were recognised as equal, or did they go back to other roles? So a couple of questions fairly similar there, Antonia.
Well, sadly, after the war, it was expected, like in other jobs, that when the men came home, they would take up the best jobs, resume the jobs they had before. So women doctors really went back to the sort of status quo as it was before the First World War. And those women who trained as doctors during the war really had the worst deal, because they'd had, may not have had much experience during the war or connections. And so a lot of them just gave up medicine, or it's difficult to track because, if you look through the medical directories after the war, some you just, there's no record. So you don't know what happened to them. There were very few of those who actually, whether it was in attached to the RAMC or in voluntary units, who'd done war surgery. Very few of them carried on and did surgery after the war. That was very unusual. If that answers the both questions, I'm not sure if I've answered both of those in one or not.
In fact, thanks for that, Antonia. No, that's splendid. We've got a couple of questions, or one observation and a question from Andrew Vollans. I think one of them, Antonia, might have been touched on in your previous answers, so forgive me if this is referring back to the previous question. So Andrew, across two different posts, has said the following. Flora Murray's book is very honest in its description of their efforts to change the views of the powers that be towards the suffragette point of view. One can almost see the quiet smile in her writing when she describes their meetings. And then he goes on, does Andrew, to say, did the change in attitude to women doctors persist beyond the end of the war? BMJ, British Medical Journal, I think is that, of that period suggests that the women should drop back to allow the men back into practice.
Yes, I mean, that was what was expected, I think. I mean, there were a few that went on and furthered their careers, but I think they were generally in the minority, sadly. In fact, Flora Murray and Louisa Garrett Anderson, Endell Street was the high point of their career. They actually retired in 1922. They'd set up a children's hospital together before the war, and that had to close because I think it ran out of money. And then Flora Murray died in 1923. Louisa Garrett Anderson did, I think, I'm not sure how much work she did after that, but obviously she'd retired, but she did operate on Blitz casualties in the Second World War.
Thanks, Antonia. That's.
Can I ask a question about Antonia? I mean, I remember we discussed this while we were talking through your dissertation when you were writing it. I mean, to what extent can we see the pioneering work of women in the First World War as actually having sown the seeds what happened in the Second World War and after? The idea that there's two steps forward but one step back in the First World War, but it still means there's one step forward.
Yes, I mean, I think it was, they were accepted more readily in the Second World War, but they didn't actually get commissions into the RAMC until 1950. So that battle was fought again, if you like. But I think they were accepted, much more easily then, And in fact, medical schools, I think, were forced, I'm not sure of the exact date, but certainly after the Second World War, that they had to all take women. But that didn't happen until about in the 1940s. I don't think it was 1948 would have been, came on. Anyway, at some point after the Second World War.
Okay, thanks for that, Antonia. Gary, we're up to 4 o'clock already. It's the old adage of time flying when you're enjoying yourself, but I am conscious that we have hit the 4 o'clock mark. I don't know if you want to sum up or ask any questions or draw any conclusions, Gary?
Well, I can't possibly sum up, but I just have a few stray thoughts which might help to bring this afternoon's proceedings together. I mean, this morning I said that it struck me that 1915 is all about it being a transitional year, that it is both the end of the beginning, as in moving from mobile warfare into static warfare. Well, that's the tail end of it anyway. But also it's learning that the war is going to be rather different from that has been prepared for before the war. And so 1915 is a year in which you see the beginning, if not of the end, at least the beginning of the middle as well. So it's a rather trite thing to say, but it is a bridge between the opening stages of the war and the deep attritional, at least, form of war, at least on the Western Front. The other point I guess I could make is that all three papers in different ways have touched upon the way in which 1915 is a critical stage in the development of total war for Britain and the British Empire. That in the case of India and Canada and the use of woman power, these are expansions on ideas which either didn't exist before the war or were there simply in embryo. I think if you take them from the perspective of the three subjects, looking back from the end of 1915, nobody 2 years before would have believed that would have happened in the course of the year. Another thing which comes out loud and clear, particularly from, well, actually from Antonia and George's talks in particular, are mentalities. And something which certainly has been an eye-opener to me over the last few years is just to get our heads around the way that people thought then, which is either different from the way we think now, or now we are thinking differently. We're starting to sort of differentiate various strands of thought. So I think that in terms of the Indian soldiers, British generals, British commanders, I think actually had, split views on it. I mean, they both feared Indian troops, I think, as we've come across, that the shadow of the mutiny of 1857 was never entirely from their memory, while admiring them simultaneously. And this is a mixture of straightforward, racial thought, but a whole other lot of cultural baggage, which is quite difficult for us to get our heads around today because we have moved beyond it, or we've moved beyond it in some ways anyway. Same way as Antonia's stuff about women. I mean, no one bats an eyelid these days if you see a woman doctor or a woman surgeon. Trying to think our way back into the mindset of 1915, however, is a really big jump. And so that's something just to finish up with. It's something which I think we all have to engage with when we look at events which are now 100 plus years ago. I've made this point before, but I think we still fall into the trap of thinking about the First World War as being current affairs, because it is just beyond living memory for some anyway. And in many ways, people seem quite similar to us. Actually, they thought very differently. Unless we get our heads around that, it's difficult to put the events of 100 years ago into a proper historical perspective. And all three papers today, in different ways, I think, helped us to come to terms with, we are talking about historical events, not contemporary events.
Great. Well, thanks for that, and thanks for the three papers, George, Antonia, and Bill. And together with the three speakers from this morning, we've certainly been entertained and educated, I believe, during the course of 2 hour sessions. I hope everybody's enjoyed it as much as I have. If we'd like to just do a final silent round of applause for not only the three afternoon speakers, but the three morning speakers as well. That's splendid. I can confirm that there's a hands going up as a round of applause. And on that note, I think we'll call that a day. So thanks to all three. Thanks to Gary for presiding over this, presiding as president. And I think that's all from me. So thanks very much.
Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, she hasn't been kissed in 40 years. Hickey, picky, parlez-vous. Out on Hickey, Armentières, parlez-vous. Out on Hickey, Armentières, parlez-vous. Out on Hickey, Armentières, officers get